Your brain is not on your side. It's on its own side. And it's been making decisions for you long before you realized it. That's not the problem. The problem is how much you trust it. Because most people don't think they have a thinking problem. They think they have an effort problem. So they push harder. They try to be more disciplined. They gather more information. And somehow, they keep ending up in the same place. Different situation. Same pattern. It's not that you're a bad decision maker. It's that you're making decisions using a model of reality that quietly stopped updating. And the worst part is, it doesn't feel broken. It feels logical. It feels earned. That's why it's so hard to catch. This is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because the gap isn't between what you know and what you don't know. It's between how you think your mind works and how it actually works. That gap is where bad decisions live, where missed patterns stack up, where the same mistake shows up again, just wearing a different face. I've seen this in people who are smart, thoughtful, well-read. Sometimes the smarter they are, the harder it is to notice. Because intelligence doesn't fix the problem. It just makes the explanation sound better after the fact. The people who navigate this well aren't always more intelligent. They're not always calmer either. What they have is a different kind of awareness. They've learned how to catch themselves in the act of thinking. Not after the decision, but during it. That's what this is about. Not fixing your mind. Not turning you into someone perfectly rational. Just helping you see what's already happening. A little earlier than you do right now. Because that moment, the one where you notice something feels off but can't explain why, that's the opening. And if you learn how to stay with it, instead of overriding it, that's where your decisions start to change. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The thinking you think you're doing. Most people believe they think strategically. This is one of the more reliable findings in cognitive psychology, and also one of the funnier ones. Ask a room full of people whether they consider long-term consequences before making decisions. Nearly every hand goes up. Then watch what they actually do under mild pressure. The hands, metaphorically, all go back down. There's a specific kind of intelligence that separates people who navigate complexity well from people who are perpetually surprised by outcomes they probably could have seen coming. It's not IQ. It's not education. It's not even experience exactly. Because experience without structured reflection mostly just makes you faster at repeating the same mistakes with more authority. The intelligence that actually matters here is strategic. And strategic intelligence is not a trait. It's a practice. It rests on 4 things, and most people are quietly skipping at least 3 of them. The first is systems thinking. When something goes wrong, a relationship, a project, a career move, the instinct is to find the event that caused it, the moment, the decision, the person. Systems thinkers don't look for events. They look for structures, because in complex situations, the visible problem is almost never the actual problem. It's a symptom. The actual problem is usually upstream, embedded in feedback loops and incentive structures that nobody stopped to examine because examining them would have been inconvenient. When a company starts bleeding customers, most people audit the sales team. A systems thinker audits the entire organism, culture, incentives, market conditions, product feedback cycles, the gap between what leadership says it values and what it actually rewards. The event is just the last domino. The interesting question is, who set the others up? The second is temporal thinking. This one is rarer than it sounds. Thinking across time horizons, not just what happens next, but what happens in 6 months, 2 years, a decade, requires holding multiple time frames in mind simultaneously. Most people can do it abstractly. Almost nobody does it consistently when under pressure, because pressure collapses time. Everything feels immediate. The urgent crowds out the important, and the important doesn't complain, so it just quietly stops happening. Warren Buffett holding a stock for 20 years, while everyone else chases quarterly returns, isn't patience as a personality trait. It's temporal thinking as a competitive strategy. He's not playing the same game. He's playing a longer one. And the longer game, almost by definition, has less competition. The third is probabilistic thinking. Most minds operate in binaries. This will work or it won't. She's trustworthy or she isn't. The market will go up or it won't. Probabilistic thinking replaces that with ranges. What's the likelihood this works? Under what conditions? What's the distribution of possible outcomes? And am I prepared for the ones on the wrong end of it? When Jeff Bezos decided to build Amazon, he didn't know it would become what it became. What he did was calculate that internet commerce had a high probability of significant growth, and that the cost of being wrong was survivable, while the cost of not trying was not. That's not visionary genius. That's probabilistic thinking applied clearly, without the distortion of either fear or wishful certainty. The fourth is leverage thinking. Not all actions are equal. Some decisions have narrow consequences. Others reshape the entire game. Strategic thinkers are obsessed with finding the second category, the small number of moves that produce disproportionately large results. They'll spend 3 weeks thinking through a single decision if that decision eliminates 3 months of corrective effort later. To someone watching from outside, this looks like slowness. It isn't. It's investment. Now here's the thing none of this requires. It doesn't require being naturally analytical. It doesn't require a particular kind of personality or a background in logic or an appetite for complexity. What it requires is the willingness to override your brain's default setting, which is to react quickly, conserve energy, and stick with what worked last time. Your brain is not optimized for strategic thinking. It's optimized for survival in environments that no longer exist. The mental shortcuts that kept your ancestors alive on the savannah are the same ones quietly undermining your decisions in the boardroom, the relationship, the long-term plan you keep meaning to execute. Metacognitive awareness is where the override begins. This is just the ability to watch yourself think, to notice when you're reasoning versus when you're rationalizing, when you're analyzing versus when you're just pattern matching on familiarity. Most people have never developed this. They have thoughts. They don't observe having thoughts. Strategic thinkers have an internal observer, something that runs quietly in the background and occasionally surfaces to say, wait. Is this actually reasoning, or does this just feel like reasoning? That question, asked honestly, changes everything. The gap between people who seem to think well and people who don't isn't talent. It's that some people have developed this observer and use it. The others are still in the savannah, reacting to things that aren't predators, missing patterns that aren't obvious, and calling it thinking. You can build the observer. That's what this is. Chapter 2. The comfortable cage. Here is something your brain does that it will never tell you about. It takes the most exhausting parts of being alive. The constant stream of decisions, evaluations, comparisons, risk assessments, and quietly automates them. Not because you asked it to, because efficiency is survival, and your brain has been optimizing for survival since long before you had opinions about it. The result is a system that runs most of your life on autopilot, while giving you the distinct impression that you're driving. This is genuinely impressive engineering. It's also, in certain contexts, a cage. Your brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy, despite being about 2% of its mass. That ratio is expensive, and your nervous system knows it. So it compresses. It builds habits, heuristics, shortcuts, mental infrastructure that handles familiar situations without requiring full conscious engagement. You don't think about how to walk. You don't consciously parse the grammar of every sentence you read. You don't reevaluate your values from scratch every morning. The system handles it, and for routine tasks, this is exactly right. You don't want to be fully present for brushing your teeth. The automation is the point. The problem arrives when the same compression gets applied to situations that actually require thought. When the brain, faced with something genuinely novel, reaches for a familiar template anyway, because familiar templates are cheap and novel analysis is expensive. The result is a decision that feels considered, but is actually just a recycled response wearing new clothes. This is mental autopilot. And it shows up in 3 ways that are worth knowing by name, because naming them is the first step to catching them. The first is pattern matching without context analysis. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. When it encounters something new, it immediately scans for the closest match in its existing library and starts applying whatever worked last time. This is fast. It's often useful. And it fails completely when the new situation resembles a previous one on the surface but differs in every way that actually matters. Business leaders who built success in stable, predictable markets often collapse when conditions become volatile. Not because they become less intelligent, but because they keep applying stable market strategies to unstable market conditions. The pattern match is close enough to feel valid. It isn't. The surface similarity is a trap, and confidence in past success is what keeps them in it. The second is emotional hijacking. When stakes feel high, when something important is on the line, when a deadline is real, when conflict is present, your nervous system activates. Stress hormones flood in, attention narrows, working memory contracts. The parts of your brain responsible for nuanced analysis get functionally overridden by the parts responsible for rapid threat response. This is why people make their worst decisions at exactly the moments when the decisions matter most. The pressure that was supposed to sharpen thinking actually degrades it. You're running on a system designed for physical emergencies during situations that require patience and precision. The wiring is wrong for the moment, and it happens automatically, which means you usually don't notice it until after. I've watched intelligent people who reason carefully in low-stakes conversations, become nearly incapable of considering alternatives under real pressure. The intelligence doesn't disappear. It just becomes inaccessible, like a library that locks its doors during the hours when you most need to read. The third is cognitive conservatism. This one is subtler and arguably more damaging than the other two, because it doesn't feel like a flaw. It feels like wisdom. Your brain treats familiar approaches as safe and novel approaches as risky, regardless of whether the familiar approach is actually working. The mental cost of trying something new isn't just effort. It's the psychological discomfort of uncertainty, and your brain prices that discomfort higher than it should. This is why people stay in situations that are clearly not serving them. Not because they can't see better options, but because the better options require stepping into unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory feels dangerous even when the current territory is quietly destroying them. The devil you know, as a cognitive strategy, has real neurological backing. It's also responsible for an enormous amount of entirely preventable human suffering. Breaking out of autopilot requires what neuroscientists call cognitive control, the capacity to consciously redirect your attention, interrupt automatic responses, and choose a different thinking mode. Think of it as a manual override for a car that otherwise drives itself. The car isn't broken. You just need to know when to take the wheel. The first step is building trigger recognition. Specific conditions that should alert you, reliably, not aspirationally, that autopilot has taken over and something more deliberate is required. Feeling stuck on a problem you've seen before. Noticing that you're avoiding a decision rather than working toward one. Experiencing a strong emotional reaction that feels disproportionate to the facts. Recognizing that you've already decided and are now just looking for confirmation. These are signals. Most people experience them and push through anyway, which is just autopilot with more momentum. The outside view method, sir, is one of the most useful tools for interrupting the pattern. Instead of focusing on all the specific details that make your current situation feel unique, and your brain will insist it's unique, because that framing protects it from having to update, you deliberately step back and ask what typically happens in situations like this one. Not your situation. Situations like yours. The reference class. This is uncomfortable because it strips away the specialness your brain has assigned to your problem. It turns out that most situations are less unique than they feel, and most outcomes are more predictable than they seem. If you're willing to look at the data instead of the narrative you've built around your specific case. The pre-mortem is the other tool worth building into your regular thinking. Before you execute a plan, you imagine it has already failed, spectacularly, completely, in ways that embarrassed everyone involved, and you work backward to figure out what caused it. This isn't pessimism. It's structured imagination used as a diagnostic. It surfaces blind spots that forward planning almost always misses, because forward planning is optimistic by default, and optimism, as a cognitive baseline, is just autopilot wearing a motivational poster. The cage is comfortable. That's not a metaphor. It literally is. The familiar feels safe, and safety feels good, and good feels like enough, until it isn't. Until the world shifts and the cage, which was never actually protecting you, turns out to have been the thing holding you in place. The override exists. You just have to decide to use it before the moment demands it. Because in the moment, autopilot will feel like clarity. It almost always does. Chapter 3: The Liar in Your Head Who Means Well. Your brain lies to you. Not occasionally, not under unusual circumstances, but constantly, systematically, and with complete structural commitment. The lies aren't malicious. They're architectural. Your brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to keep you functional in a world that contains more information than any nervous system can fully process. And the price of that functionality is a set of predictable, consistent, and largely invisible distortions in how you perceive reality. These are cognitive biases. And the first thing worth understanding about them is that knowing they exist provides substantially less protection against them than people assume. This is, itself, a bias. The bias blind spot. The tendency to recognize cognitive distortions clearly in other people while remaining largely immune to detecting them in yourself. Studies consistently show that people with the most knowledge about cognitive biases are not meaningfully better at avoiding them in their own decisions. What the knowledge does is make them more confident that they're avoiding them, which is its own kind of problem. So let's be precise about what's actually happening in your head. Confirmation bias is the operating system beneath everything else. Once you form a belief about a person, a situation, a strategy, yourself, your brain begins filtering incoming information to support that belief. Not metaphorically, literally. Information that contradicts your existing position gets processed differently, weighted differently, remembered differently than information that confirms it. You don't experience this as filtering. You experience it as thinking. The insidious part is that the more you research a topic after forming an initial view, the more validated you feel. Because research conducted through a confirmation bias lens mostly surfaces confirming evidence. You walk away feeling thorough. You weren't thorough. You were thorough in one direction. Intelligent, well-educated people hold completely contradictory views about identical sets of facts, not because one of them is stupid, but because they started from different initial positions, and their confirmation bias did the rest. The intelligence doesn't protect you. In some ways, it works against you, because smarter people are better at constructing sophisticated justifications for conclusions they reached emotionally. The availability heuristic is quieter, but touches almost every risk assessment you make. Your brain judges the probability of events based on how easily it can recall examples. Vivid, recent, emotionally charged examples feel common. Mundane, undramatic risks feel rare. This is why people consistently overestimate the danger of plane crashes and underestimate the danger of driving. The plane crash is memorable. The car accident is not. It also distorts how you evaluate yourself. If your failures are more emotionally salient than your successes, and for many people they are, your brain will construct a self-assessment that underweights your actual track record. You'll feel less capable than you are. Not because the evidence suggests it, but because failure memories are louder. The reverse is equally true and equally problematic. If your successes are what come to mind most easily, you'll overestimate your reliability in ways that produce exactly the kind of overconfidence that precedes the failures you're not remembering. Anchoring is the one that should make you uncomfortable every time you negotiate, estimate, or form an initial impression, which is always. The first piece of information you encounter about anything becomes a reference point that all subsequent judgments adjust from. Even when you know the anchor is arbitrary. Even when you've been explicitly told it's irrelevant. The adjustment happens, but it's almost always insufficient. You end up closer to the anchor than the evidence warrants. This is why extreme initial offers in negotiations work. Why first impressions are so sticky. Why it's so difficult to revise an early estimate even after receiving compelling, contradictory information. You think you're updating. You're adjusting. There's a difference, and the gap between them is where a lot of bad decisions live. The planning fallacy is worth its own careful attention because it operates in almost every goal you've ever set. You systematically underestimate how long things will take, how much they'll cost, and how many complications will emerge. Not because you're careless, because when you plan, your brain naturally focuses on the specific scenario you've imagined. The one where things go roughly as intended, and fails to adequately weight the full historical distribution of how similar things have actually gone. Every software project that runs over deadline, Every renovation that costs twice the estimate. Every personal goal that seemed achievable in January and quietly disappeared by March. The planning fallacy isn't a failure of effort. It's a failure of reference class. You're predicting based on your imagined scenario rather than on what typically happens to people attempting scenarios like yours. The fix isn't optimism or pessimism. It's asking a different question. Not how long will this take, but how long do things like this typically take? And then adjusting from there based on what's genuinely specific about your situation, rather than treating your situation as uniquely exempt from the patterns that govern everyone else. Overconfidence bias sits underneath the planning fallacy and several others. When asked to estimate something and provide a confidence range, most people give ranges that are far too narrow. Things they believe have a 5% chance of occurring actually occur 20 to 30% of the time. The subjective feeling of certainty is a very poor proxy for actual accuracy. But it feels like accuracy. That feeling is the problem. Then there are the social and motivational biases, the ones that protect your self-image at the cost of accurate perception. Self-serving bias causes you to attribute successes to your skill and failures to circumstances. Attribution bias causes you to judge other people's mistakes as character flaws, while judging your own as situational. These aren't just flattering distortions. They're learning blockers. If your failures are always someone else's fault, or the result of bad luck, you never accumulate the accurate feedback necessary to actually improve. Here is what all of this adds up to. Your brain is not a neutral instrument for processing reality. It's a prediction machine with strong preferences, deep habits, and a near-total commitment to confirming whatever it already believes. The question isn't whether these biases affect you. They do. The question is whether you've built any systems to counteract them. Red team analysis is one. Deliberately assigning yourself or someone else the role of arguing against your preferred position, not to be contrarian, to stress test reasoning that hasn't been properly challenged. Most ideas that feel solid haven't actually been challenged. They've just been agreed with, which is different. Base rate analysis is another. Before predicting outcomes for your specific situation, research what typically happens in comparable situations. Ground your expectations in empirical patterns rather than narrative optimism. The base rate won't tell you what will happen. It will tell you what usually happens, which is an enormously useful starting point that most people skip entirely. The goal isn't to become paralyzed by doubt. Appropriate confidence calibrated to actual evidence is not the same as chronic uncertainty. You can be decisive and accurate. The two are not in tension. What you cannot be, not reliably, not sustainably, is confident and unexamined. The liar in your head means well. It's genuinely trying to help. But it will keep lying to you consistently and invisibly for as long as you let it operate without supervision. Chapter 4. The Toolbox Nobody Showed You. At some point in your education, someone taught you facts, dates, formulas, vocabulary, procedures. What almost nobody taught you was how to think about problems you've never seen before, how to look at a situation in one domain and recognize that it's structurally identical to something in a completely different domain, how to carry an insight from one field into another and use it to see something that everyone around you is missing. This is what mental models do, and most people are navigating an extraordinarily complex world with about 3 of them. A mental model is just a simplified representation of how something works. A thinking tool. A lens that makes certain patterns visible that would otherwise blend into the background noise of complexity. The extraordinary thing about mental models isn't that they help you understand the situations they were designed for. It's that they transfer. A mental model that explains something in physics can illuminate something in psychology. A model from ecology can clarify something in organizational behavior. This is why people who have internalized a wide range of mental models tend to seem unusually perceptive. Not because they're smarter, but because they're seeing through more lenses simultaneously. Most people are looking through one lens. Some have two. The person who has 20 doesn't see a different world. They see the same world with significantly fewer blind spots. Consider compound interest. Most people understand this concept in financial terms. Money earning returns that then earn returns, creating exponential growth over time. Useful enough. But compound interest is a general-purpose model that describes any system where outputs become inputs. Knowledge compounds. Each thing you learn creates a foundation that makes the next thing easier to learn. The person who reads consistently for 20 years doesn't just know more than the person who read sporadically. They think differently because the architecture of their understanding is structurally richer. Skills compound in the same way. Relationships compound. Trust built through repeated positive interactions creates a relational infrastructure that makes every future interaction cheaper and more productive. Reputation compounds. Attention compounds. Even decision-making quality compounds. If you're systematically learning from your decisions rather than just moving past them. When you understand compound interest as a general model rather than a financial concept, you start asking a different question about where you spend your time. Not what produces results now, but what produces results that produce results. The compounding question. Most people never ask it, which is why they're always working harder than they need to be and still falling behind. Feedback loops are the foundational model for understanding why systems behave the way they do, why some things spiral and others stabilize, why some problems fix themselves and others metastasize regardless of intervention. Reinforcing loops amplify. Success attracts resources, which enable more success. Confidence improves performance, which builds more confidence. These loops feel great when they're running in your favor. They're catastrophic when they run the other way. Self-doubt degrades performance, which produces more self-doubt. Organizational dysfunction creates stress, which produces poor decisions, which deepens the dysfunction. The loop doesn't care about the direction. It just amplifies whatever's already moving. Balancing loops stabilize. They're the reason markets don't grow forever and ecosystems don't collapse in a single season. When prices get too high, demand falls, which pushes prices back down. When you're too cold, you shiver to generate heat, which warms you, which stops the shivering. These loops are the universe's error correction mechanism, and recognizing them helps you understand why certain problems are self-limiting and others require deliberate intervention. Most complex situations contain multiple feedback loops operating simultaneously, pulling in different directions. Understanding which loop is dominant tells you more about what's actually happening than almost any amount of surface-level analysis. Leverage points extend naturally from systems thinking. The core insight is that within any system, some interventions produce enormous effects and others produce almost none, regardless of how much effort they require. Changing a number within a system, like adjusting a budget target, is low leverage. The system absorbs the change and reverts. Changing the rules that govern the system is higher leverage. Changing the goals of the system is higher still. Changing the paradigm, the underlying belief structure from which the system arose, is the highest leverage of all, and also the hardest. Because paradigms are largely invisible to the people operating within them. Most people intervene at the lowest leverage points available and wonder why nothing changes. They adjust numbers. They try harder. They optimize parameters inside a structure that's producing exactly the outcomes it's designed to produce. Expected value thinking gives you a practical framework for making decisions under uncertainty. The logic is straightforward. Multiply the probability of each possible outcome by its value, sum the results, and compare your options on that basis. An opportunity with a 90% chance of modest success might be less valuable than one with a 30% chance of extraordinary success, depending on the actual payoffs involved. You need to run the numbers, not just assess the odds. But the deeper value of expected value thinking isn't the calculation. It's the habit of mind it produces. The refusal to evaluate opportunities based purely on likelihood of success. The recognition that low probability outcomes can dominate expected value if their payoff is large enough. The understanding that most people systematically avoid high-variance opportunities even when the expected value is clearly superior, because variance feels like risk, and risk feels like danger, and danger triggers the brain's loss aversion machinery, regardless of what the math says. Optionality is the model that changes how you think about career decisions, investment choices, and resource allocation. An option is the right, but not the obligation, to do something. Options are valuable precisely because they preserve upside while limiting downside. The more options you have, the more ways you can respond to a future that doesn't unfold the way you expected. Developing diverse skills creates optionality. Maintaining financial reserves creates optionality. Building relationships across different industries and contexts creates optionality. None of these feel immediately productive in the way that focused, specialized effort feels productive. They feel like inefficiency. They're insurance, and the value of insurance is invisible until you need it. Incentives is the model that explains more human behavior than any other single concept. People respond to what's actually rewarded, not what's officially valued. If you want to understand why someone does what they do, ignore what they say about their motivations and look at what behaviors their environment reinforces. The gap between stated values and actual incentives is where organizational dysfunction lives, where policy failures are born, where the difference between what people claim to care about and what they actually pursue becomes visible to anyone paying attention. I find this model quietly clarifying in almost every confusing human situation. Someone's behavior that seems irrational usually makes complete sense once you map the incentives accurately. The irrationality is almost never in the person. It's in the structure surrounding them. The point isn't to memorize these models as a list. That's just more facts, which you already have enough of. The point is to internalize them deeply enough that they become reflexive, that when you encounter a difficult situation, you automatically start seeing it through multiple lenses rather than just one. Charlie Munger called this a latticework of models. The image is apt. A single model is a straight line. Multiple models, properly integrated, form a structure, something you can stand on, something that holds weight. Most people are working with a straight line and wondering why things keep collapsing. Chapter 5. Strip it down. Here is something worth sitting with. Most of what you call your own thinking isn't yours. Not in a conspiratorial sense, in a much more mundane and therefore harder to argue with sense. The frameworks you use to evaluate opportunities, the assumptions you carry about what's possible in your industry, the mental boundaries you've drawn around what counts as a realistic option. Most of these were handed to you. By education, by convention, by the people around you who were themselves operating on inherited frameworks. You absorbed them the way you absorbed language. Fluently, unconsciously, early enough that they feel like perception rather than assumption. First principles thinking is the practice of finding those assumptions and questioning them. Not for sport, because the distance between what's conventionally believed to be possible and what's actually possible is often enormous. And the people who close that distance are almost always the ones who stopped accepting inherited constraints as though they were laws of physics. The distinction matters. Laws of physics are non-negotiable. Everything else is up for examination. Most people never examine it. Not because they're incurious, but because examining foundational assumptions is genuinely uncomfortable. It requires admitting that a significant portion of what you've been calling reasoning has actually been inheritance. That the careful thinking you've been doing has been careful within a set of premises you never chose. That the cage, to use a word we've already established, is partly made of ideas you mistook for facts. Analogical thinking is the default mode of nearly every human mind, and it's useful most of the time. You encounter a new situation, your brain scans its library for the closest match, and you apply whatever worked in the analogous case. Fast, efficient, often adequate. The problem is that analogical thinking inherits constraints. When you reason from analogy, you're not just borrowing a solution, you're borrowing the entire architecture of assumptions the solution was built on. If those assumptions no longer apply, or never applied to your situation, you're now executing a strategy that's optimized for a reality that doesn't exist. First principles thinking replaces the question, "What does this remind me of?" with what is actually true here. It asks, what are the fundamental components of this situation, stripped of convention, precedent, and inherited framing? What would this look like if nobody had ever attempted it before? Elon Musk applied this to rocket manufacturing in a way that's become almost overused as an example. But it's overused because it's genuinely illustrative. The conventional wisdom was that rockets are expensive, not expensively designed, not inefficiently manufactured, just inherently, fundamentally expensive. This is what decades of aerospace industry consensus had produced. And if you reason by analogy, comparing SpaceX to previous rocket companies, you accept that constraint and compete within it. Musk didn't ask, how do we make rockets less expensive than other rocket companies? He asked, what is a rocket, actually, at the material level, and what should those materials cost? The answer revealed that the raw material cost of a rocket was a small fraction of what rockets actually sold for. The expense wasn't physical, it was structural, a product of design assumptions, business model conventions, and the fact that nobody had seriously questioned whether rockets needed to be single-use. There's no law of physics requiring a rocket to be thrown away after one flight. That was a convention. A very expensive, very widely accepted convention that had calcified into something that felt like fact. Reusable rockets followed. Launch costs dropped dramatically. An entire competitive landscape shifted. The breakthrough wasn't technical in the first instance. It was conceptual. It came from someone being willing to ask the question that the industry had collectively decided was unnecessary. This pattern repeats. Netflix asked what customers actually want from entertainment, not what the existing rental model provided. The answer, immediate access to a large library, without late fees, without trips to a physical store, was obvious once the question was asked honestly. But the question required abandoning the frame of "we are a video rental company" and replacing it with "we are in the business of delivering entertainment value." Different premises, completely different conclusions. Amazon asked what commerce actually requires, not what retail had historically looked like. What commerce actually requires: a buyer, a seller, a transaction, delivery of value. Stripped of the assumption that retail requires physical presence, an enormous amount became possible. You can apply this to your own domain. Start by identifying the constraints you've accepted as given. The things you treat as fixed costs, immovable limitations, or obvious requirements. Then ask for each one: is this a law, or is this a convention? Is this physically necessary, or is this just how it's always been done? Most constraints are conventions. Some are well-reasoned conventions. Some are just habits that nobody has bothered to re-examine because the current approach is functional enough. Functional enough is the enemy of significantly better. The process has 3 stages, and they're worth making explicit because skipping any one of them produces incomplete results. The first is assumption excavation. You surface everything you're taking for granted about the problem, not just the obvious assumptions, but the ones so deeply embedded that they don't feel like assumptions at all. They feel like the problem itself. Ask why repeatedly, not as a rhetorical device, but as a genuine investigative tool. Why does this need to work this way? Why is this a constraint? Why hasn't this been done differently? The answer you're looking for isn't a justification. It's a foundation, or the discovery that there isn't one. The second is decomposition. You break the problem into its most fundamental components, the actual physical, logical, or human requirements, stripped of the packaging that convention has wrapped around them. This is where you discover that what looked like one complex problem is often several simpler problems that have been bundled together by habit or convenience. Unbundling is itself a form of innovation. The third is reconstruction. You build solutions upward from the actual components and actual requirements, without inheriting the architecture of previous attempts. This is the generative stage, where possibilities emerge that analogical thinking couldn't have produced, because they require stepping outside the frame that analogical thinking operates within. Here's what I want to be honest about. This process is uncomfortable, and not just intellectually. There is something genuinely unsettling about discovering how much of your thinking has been operating on premises you never examined. It creates a kind of vertigo, the sense that the ground was softer than it looked. Most people respond to this by retreating to the familiar frameworks quickly, because the familiar frameworks feel stable even when they aren't working. The willingness to stay in the discomfort, to actually rebuild your understanding from the ground up rather than patching the existing structure, is what separates first principles thinking as an occasional insight from first principles thinking as a genuine capability. Conceptual independence is the phrase I'd use for what you develop when this becomes a real skill. You're no longer constrained by the ceiling that other people's assumptions have placed on the problem. You can see what's actually required rather than what's conventionally attempted. In a world where conventional approaches are becoming obsolete faster than they can be replaced, conceptual independence is not a luxury. It's the difference between being someone who responds to change and being someone who generates it. Most people will read this, and find it interesting. Fewer will sit down with an actual problem they're stuck on, excavate its assumptions, and rebuild their approach from scratch. That gap between finding something interesting and using it is the same gap we started with. Still there. Still worth closing. Chapter 6. Thinking Under Fire. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives right after a high-pressure decision goes wrong. Everything you should have considered becomes suddenly, painfully obvious. The overlooked factor announces itself. The alternative you dismissed too quickly reveals why it deserved more attention. The reasoning that felt so solid in the moment looks, in retrospect, like a first draft that never got edited. This isn't hindsight bias exactly. It's something more specific. It's what happens when the pressure lifts and your actual cognitive capacity comes back online, and you realize, with some discomfort, that the version of you who made the decision was operating with significantly less of it. Pressure doesn't reveal your worst thinking. It reveals your default thinking. For most people, those turn out to be the same thing. Here's the mechanism. When you perceive urgency, threat, or high stakes, your nervous system responds with a physiological cascade. Cortisol, adrenaline, a narrowing of attention, a contraction of working memory. This response evolved for physical emergencies. It's genuinely useful when the threat is immediate and physical and the correct response is fast and simple. Run, fight, freeze. It is not useful when the threat is a complex negotiation, a strategic business decision, or any situation where the correct response requires holding multiple variables in mind simultaneously, considering second-order effects, and resisting the pull of the most immediately obvious option. For those situations, the stress response is not just unhelpful, it's actively degrading your ability to think. Precisely when thinking is what the moment requires. The cruel irony is structural. The higher the stakes, the stronger the stress response. The stronger the stress response, the worse your cognitive performance. The worse your cognitive performance, the lower the quality of the decision. The lower the quality of the decision, the higher the probability of the bad outcome you were stressed about. The system produces the result it was trying to prevent. Understanding this doesn't make you immune to it, but it does change what you prepare for. Stress inoculation is the first tool worth building. The concept comes from military and emergency training, and the logic is straightforward. If you practice decision-making under pressure in controlled environments, your brain develops the neural infrastructure to maintain cognitive function when real pressure arrives. Not immunity, the stress response still fires, but the capacity to access analytical thinking despite it. You can apply this without a military training program. If presentations under pressure are a relevant skill for you, practice them while physically exhausted, or on abbreviated timelines, or in front of people whose opinions create genuine discomfort. If financial decisions under stress are the concern, simulate the emotional weight with scenarios that carry real psychological stakes. The goal is gradual, structured exposure to the conditions that degrade your thinking, so that those conditions become less novel, and novelty is a significant part of what amplifies the stress response in the first place. The brain adapts to what it repeatedly encounters. Repeatedly encountering pressure in controlled contexts is the closest available approximation to becoming good at pressure. There is no shortcut that skips the exposure. Decision-making protocols are the second tool, and arguably more immediately practical. A protocol is a predetermined thinking framework that you execute when your natural cognitive capacity is compromised. Its value is precisely that it was designed outside the pressure, when you were thinking clearly, and can therefore be trusted when you aren't. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, originated in military strategy and translates cleanly to high-pressure civilian decisions. Under pressure, you systematically observe what's actually happening rather than what you assumed was happening. You orient by clarifying your actual objectives and the relevant context. You decide on a course of action based on that analysis. You act decisively, without waiting for certainty that isn't coming, and you remain ready to re-enter the loop as conditions change. Because conditions always change. What the OODA loop prevents is the two failure modes that pressure most reliably produces. The first is reactive action, moving before you've adequately observed and oriented, which is how pressure creates decisions that feel decisive and turn out to be just fast. The second is analysis paralysis, the loop of repeated orientation without decision, which pressure also produces when the stakes feel too high to risk being wrong. The loop gives you a structure. The structure gives you something to execute when improvisation has become unreliable. For situations where multiple options need to be compared quickly, a rapid decision matrix is useful. List your main options. Identify the 3 most important criteria for evaluating them. Not 15 criteria, 3, because pressure doesn't leave room for exhaustive analysis, and pretending otherwise produces the illusion of rigor without the substance. Score each option against each criterion. The matrix doesn't make the decision for you. It prevents you from making the decision based entirely on whichever option felt most salient in the moment, which is what unstructured pressure thinking almost always produces. Temporal thinking under pressure deserves its own attention because pressure's primary cognitive effect is time compression. Everything feels immediate. Long-term consequences become invisible, not because you've forgotten they exist, but because the stress response has functionally narrowed your attention to the present moment. You're making permanent decisions with temporary horizon thinking. The 10-10-10 rule is a simple counter. Before committing to a significant decision under pressure, run 3 quick questions. How will I feel about this choice in 10 minutes, in 10 months, in 10 years? This isn't a comprehensive analysis. It's a forced perspective shift, a deliberate interruption of the time compression that pressure produces. Often the 10-year question alone is sufficient to reveal that the urgency you're feeling is real, but the timeline you're responding to is not. This connects to one of the most underused tools in pressure management: questioning whether the deadline is real. Many urgent decisions aren't actually urgent. The urgency is manufactured by other people's preferences, by anxiety, by the social discomfort of appearing to deliberate when everyone else seems ready to move. Before accepting time pressure as a fixed constraint, ask whether the deadline can be moved. Ask what it would actually cost to take another day, another hour, another conversation before deciding. Often the answer is very little. And the difference between a decision made in an hour and a decision made in a day, when the decision is genuinely important, is frequently the difference between something you'll defend confidently and something you'll be quietly revising for months. There is also a category of decisions that should simply be deferred, not indefinitely, but until specific conditions are met. Strategic thinkers treat declining to make a premature decision as a decision. It has a cost and a benefit, like any other choice. The cost is delay. The benefit is the possibility of better information, clearer thinking, or options that don't yet exist. Whether the benefit exceeds the cost depends on the specific situation, but the analysis should be conscious rather than defaulting to whoever is creating the most pressure. The last thing worth saying about thinking under fire is about perfectionism, because perfectionism and pressure interact in a specific and reliably destructive way. Perfectionism under pressure doesn't produce better decisions. It produces delayed decisions that eventually become default outcomes, the result of not deciding rather than of deciding poorly. And default outcomes are almost always worse than conscious choices, because at least conscious choices were made by someone who was trying. Good enough, under genuine pressure, is not a compromise. It's the correct standard. The question isn't whether this is the optimal decision. The question is whether this decision meets the minimum viable criteria for an acceptable outcome, given what you actually know right now. If yes, make it. If no, identify specifically what additional information would change your answer, and go get that information, rather than continuing to rotate the existing information until it feels different. Pressure will come. It always does. The variable isn't whether you'll face it. It's whether the version of you that faces it will have any infrastructure in place, or whether you'll be improvising with a degraded brain in a high-stakes moment and hoping the outcome is better than the process deserves. Hope is not a decision-making protocol. Chapter 7. What you see before anyone else does. There is a specific cognitive experience that separates people who navigate complexity well from people who are perpetually reacting to it. It's the moment when something clicks into place, when a pattern becomes visible before it's obvious, before the headlines confirm it, before everyone else in the room has caught up. It feels like intuition. It isn't exactly. It's something more structural than that, and more learnable. Pattern recognition at the expert level isn't a gift. It's the product of systematic attention applied consistently over time, combined with a mental library rich enough to generate meaningful comparisons. Chess grandmasters don't see the board differently because they're smarter. They see it differently because they've stored thousands of configurations and their brains have learned, through repetition, which configurations tend to produce which outcomes. When they look at a position, they're not calculating from scratch. They're pattern matching against a library that took decades to build. You have a library too. The question is whether you've been building it deliberately or just accumulating experiences without extracting the patterns. Most people observe their environment passively. Things happen, they notice the ones that directly affect them, and they move on. This produces a library of anecdotes. Anecdotes are useful for conversation. They're nearly useless for prediction. What produces prediction is systematic observation, the deliberate practice of looking for recurrences, cycles, and structural similarities across different contexts and time periods. The starting point is identifying the key variables in whatever domain matters most to you and tracking how they move relative to each other. Not just what happens, but what happens before what happens. The sequence, the lead time, the early indicators that a larger pattern is beginning to form. This is the concept of leading indicators, and it's one of the most practically valuable ideas in strategic thinking. A leading indicator is a signal that changes before the main trend becomes visible. It's the early movement that precedes the larger movement. People who consistently seem to see things early aren't clairvoyant. They've identified which signals reliably precede which outcomes in their specific domain, and they monitor those signals while everyone else is monitoring the outcomes. In business, Leading indicators might be subtle shifts in customer language, the specific words people use when describing problems, which often change before purchasing behavior changes, or early movement in credit conditions, which historically precede broader economic shifts, or the pattern of which employees are leaving an organization, which tends to predict cultural trajectory far more accurately than any internal survey. In personal relationships, leading indicators are the small behavioral changes that precede larger ones. The slight withdrawal before a significant conversation. The pattern of how someone handles low-stakes disagreements, which reliably predicts how they'll handle high-stakes ones. These signals are visible. Most people don't see them because they're not looking systematically. They're waiting for the outcome to announce itself and then responding to that. The challenge is distinguishing signal from noise, and it's a real challenge. Not every early movement is the beginning of a meaningful pattern. Markets generate false signals constantly. People have bad weeks that don't represent trends. Organizations go through disruptions that don't alter their fundamental trajectory. The skill isn't just detecting early signals, it's calibrating your sensitivity, developing the judgment to know which signals deserve elevated attention and which are just the normal volatility of complex systems. This calibration comes from historical analysis, which is the foundation of serious pattern recognition. Current events feel unprecedented. They almost never are. Most seemingly novel situations are structural variations of patterns that have played out many times before in different contexts, different industries, different eras. The surface details change. The underlying dynamics recur. Studying history in the relevant domains isn't nostalgia. It's the construction of a comparison library. When you know how previous organizations responded to technological disruption, you can recognize the early stages of the same dynamic playing out again. Not because history repeats exactly, but because human behavior under similar pressures tends to rhyme closely enough to be useful. The denial phase, the adaptation attempts, the overreaction, the eventual restructuring. The pattern has texture that you can learn to recognize before the final chapters arrive. Mark Twain's observation that history doesn't repeat, but often rhymes is, among other things, a practical instruction for strategic thinkers. You're not looking for identical situations. You're looking for structural similarities. The same underlying forces producing recognizable shapes in different materials. Scenario planning is the tool that operationalizes this for forward-looking decisions. Instead of trying to predict one specific future, which is almost always wrong in its details even when directionally correct, you develop 3 to 5 plausible scenarios that represent genuinely different ways the relevant uncertainties could resolve. For each scenario, you identify what strategies would work best and what early signals would indicate that scenario is becoming more likely. The value of this process isn't the scenarios themselves, it's what building them does to your attention. When you've thought carefully about multiple possible futures and identified the leading indicators for each, you become significantly more sensitive to early signals, because you've already done the work of connecting signals to outcomes. You're not processing new information from scratch. You're updating probabilities in a framework that already exists. This is the difference between being surprised by change and recognizing it early. The person who's surprised was waiting for the outcome. The person who recognized it early was monitoring the indicators. Cross-domain pattern recognition extends this further. The same structural patterns appear in biology, economics, technology, psychology, and social systems, often with different labels but identical underlying mechanics. Network effects look the same whether you're studying the spread of a technology platform or the growth of a social movement, or the development of a coral reef ecosystem. Viral spread dynamics appear in epidemiology, social media, financial contagion, and cultural trends. Predator-prey cycles show up in competitive markets with striking regularity. When you recognize a pattern in one domain, you gain predictive leverage in every domain where the same structure appears. This is one of the genuine advantages of wide reading and genuine intellectual curiosity, not as self-improvement theater, but as the systematic expansion of your pattern library into domains that share structural features with the ones you navigate daily. Cycle recognition deserves particular attention because cycles are among the most reliable and most ignored patterns in complex systems. Economic cycles, competitive cycles, organizational energy cycles, personal productivity cycles. They repeat with enough regularity that their shapes are recognizable even when their timing isn't precise. The most consistent feature of cycles isn't their duration. It's their emotional signature at the extremes. Unsustainable optimism precedes downturns. Unsustainable pessimism precedes recoveries. The specific timing is hard to predict. The emotional extremes are hard to miss if you're paying attention to sentiment rather than just price. And then there's pattern degradation, the flip side of pattern recognition that most people forget to account for. Patterns that have been reliable can become unreliable when underlying conditions change. The film industry's patterns governed by physical media didn't survive digital distribution. Communication patterns stable for generations didn't survive social media. When a previously reliable pattern starts producing unexpected results, the instinct is to assume noise, to wait for the pattern to reassert itself. Sometimes it will. Sometimes the unexpected results are the leading indicator that the pattern itself has broken, that a new underlying structure is forming, and that the old map is no longer describing the territory. Knowing when to trust a pattern and when to question whether it still applies is one of the harder judgments in strategic thinking. It requires holding two things simultaneously: confidence in your historical analysis and genuine openness to the possibility that the history has stopped being a reliable guide. Most people default to one or the other. They either overtrust their patterns and get blindsided by structural change, or they abandon patterns at the first sign of disruption and lose the genuine predictive advantage their library had been providing. The balance is active. It requires monitoring not just whether your predictions are coming true, but whether the mechanisms that were supposed to produce them are still operating. Prediction without mechanism is just guessing with a backstory. What you see before anyone else does is a function of what you've trained yourself to look for. That training is available. Most people just never start it. Chapter 8. The art of breaking the monster down. The specific feeling of being overwhelmed by a complex problem has a texture that's worth examining. It's not quite confusion. It's not quite fear. It's the sensation of standing in front of something that feels like a single massive object. Solid, opaque, too large to get your hands around. When what you're actually facing is a collection of smaller, manageable components that have been bundled together by habit, anxiety, or insufficient analysis. The monster isn't big, it's undecomposed. This distinction matters enormously because the response to a genuinely large single problem and the response to an unexamined bundle of smaller problems are completely different. The first might require exceptional resources or capabilities. The second requires a specific cognitive skill, the ability to decompose effectively, and that skill is learnable, transferable, and dramatically underused. Complexity, in most cases, is not a property of the problem. It's a property of how the problem is being held. When you examine the architecture carefully, when you separate what's actually interconnected from what merely appears adjacent, most complex problems reveal themselves as several simpler problems with defined interfaces. The solving doesn't necessarily become easy, but it becomes possible in a way it wasn't when everything was fused into a single, undifferentiated mass. Structural decomposition is where most problem-solving should start. Before you attempt to solve anything, you map what you're actually dealing with. What are the main components? What are the relationships between them? Which relationships are causal and which are merely correlational? Because these require fundamentally different interventions. For a business challenge, the structural components might include market dynamics, internal capabilities, competitive positioning, financial constraints, and organizational culture. For a personal challenge, they might include skills gaps, resource limitations, emotional barriers, time constraints, and relationship factors. The specific categories matter less than the discipline of identifying them explicitly, rather than treating the whole situation as a single undivided thing. The relationship mapping that follows the component identification is where the real insight usually lives. Which components influence which others? Where are the feedback loops? The places where component A affects component B, which then cycles back to affect component A. These loops are often where problems persist despite repeated intervention, because you keep addressing the visible symptom while the loop quietly regenerates it. Once you've mapped the structure, you frequently discover that what presented as one complex problem is actually two or three simpler problems that were interacting in ways that created the appearance of unified complexity. Separating them doesn't just make each more tractable, it also makes the interactions between them explicit, which means you can manage those interactions deliberately rather than stumbling into them. Functional decomposition approaches the same territory from a different angle. Instead of asking what the problem consists of, you ask what needs to happen to resolve it. What are the functions, the actual processes and transformations that a solution requires? For each function, what inputs are needed and what outputs should result? This approach is particularly useful for operational and procedural problems, where the challenge is designing or improving a workflow rather than analyzing a static situation. Breaking down by function reveals dependencies, which processes must complete before others can begin, which can run in parallel, which are the critical path that constrains the entire timeline regardless of how much effort you pour into everything else. Critical path identification is, in itself, one of the most underused leverage tools in project management and problem solving. The critical path is the sequence of dependent steps that determines the minimum possible timeline for a given outcome. Everything not on the critical path can be improved without affecting the overall timeline. Only improvements to critical path activities actually accelerate outcomes. Most people optimize things that feel important. Effective decomposers optimize the things that are actually blocking progress. Temporal decomposition separates problems by time horizon, and it solves a specific confusion that makes many problems feel more overwhelming than they are. Complex challenges typically contain immediate urgent issues, medium-term developmental requirements, and long-term strategic considerations, all bundled together and experienced simultaneously as a single oppressive weight. Separating these layers isn't just organizationally convenient, it's cognitively essential. Immediate issues require tactical responses with available resources, Medium-term challenges require capacity building, developing capabilities that don't yet exist. Long-term positioning requires strategic choices about direction that are meaningless without first resolving the immediate and medium-term layers. Mixing these time horizons doesn't just create confusion about what to do, it creates confusion about what kind of thing to do, which is a worse kind of confusion. When you separate the temporal layers and work each one with appropriate tools and timelines, something usually becomes visible that wasn't before. Many of the urgent issues are symptoms of the medium-term or long-term problems. They keep recurring not because you haven't solved them, but because you keep solving the symptom while the underlying structure continues generating it. Temporal decomposition makes this visible in a way that treating everything as urgent never can. Constraint-based decomposition focuses specifically on the limitations you're operating within and what category each limitation belongs to. This matters because different categories of constraint require fundamentally different responses. Some constraints are physical or legal facts that cannot be changed and must be worked around. Some are resource limitations that could be addressed with sufficient investment or creativity. Some are self-imposed restrictions, assumptions you've made about what's allowable or achievable that you've never actually tested. And some are social constraints, things that feel fixed because the people around you treat them as fixed, though nobody has verified whether they actually are. The theory of constraints makes a specific and useful point here. At any given moment, one constraint is limiting your progress more than all the others combined. Identifying and addressing that primary constraint is where virtually all your leverage lives. Once you address it, a different constraint becomes primary. Progress happens through a sequence of constraint identifications and resolutions, not through simultaneous improvement across all fronts. Most people improve things that aren't the primary constraint, and then wonder why their overall results don't improve proportionally. They're optimizing non-bottlenecks, making things that aren't limiting go faster, while the actual limiting factor remains unchanged. Root cause decomposition is the discipline of refusing to stop at the symptom. The visible problem is almost never the actual problem. It's the most recent expression of a chain of causation that runs somewhere upstream, and addressing the visible expression without addressing the chain just means the problem will regenerate. The 5 whys technique is simple enough to seem trivial and powerful enough that serious organizations use it as a formal diagnostic. When you encounter a problem, ask why it happened. Then ask why that happened. Then ask why that happened. Continue until you reach a cause that is actually fundamental, one that is not itself a symptom of something deeper. Most people stop at the second or third why because the answer they get there feels actionable. The root cause is usually at the 4th or 5th, and it often turns out to be structural rather than individual, a system producing its natural outputs, not a person making unusual errors. Fishbone diagrams extend this by ensuring you consider multiple categories of potential cause rather than drilling down the most obvious causal chain. You map the visible problem, identify the major cause categories relevant to your domain, and within each category, you identify specific potential contributing factors. The visual structure does something that pure verbal analysis often doesn't. It prevents premature closure, the cognitive tendency to stop looking once you've found a satisfying explanation. Premature closure is one of the most common failure modes in problem analysis. You find a cause that's plausible and emotionally satisfying, often one that confirms existing beliefs or assigns responsibility clearly, and you stop looking. The fishbone forces you to keep looking even after you've found something, because the diagram isn't complete until all branches are populated. Stakeholder decomposition rounds out the toolkit by addressing the human dimension that purely structural analysis misses. Complex problems usually involve multiple people or groups with different interests, different constraints, and different definitions of what a good outcome looks like. Solutions that are technically elegant but politically unworkable aren't solutions. They're proposals. Mapping stakeholders explicitly, identifying their actual interests rather than their stated positions, understanding the conflicts between different groups, designing solutions that address the legitimate needs of everyone whose cooperation is required, transforms problem-solving from an analytical exercise into something that can actually be implemented. The most common reason technically sound solutions fail is not that they don't work. It's that they don't account for the human and organizational dynamics surrounding the problem. Stakeholder decomposition makes those dynamics visible before implementation rather than during it, which is when they're cheapest to address. Put all of this together, and the monster doesn't disappear. But it stops being a monster. It becomes a structured set of defined problems with identifiable components, clear relationships, explicit constraints, traceable root causes, and mapped stakeholders. Which is, if you think about it, just a list of things to do. The overwhelm was never in the problem. It was in how you were holding it. Chapter 9. The intelligence you keep ignoring. There is a particular kind of person who prides themselves on rational decision-making. They're suspicious of emotion in professional contexts. They treat feelings as interference, static on the signal, noise to be filtered out so the clean analytical data can come through. They make decisions with careful logic and minimal sentiment and consider this a cognitive virtue. These people are, with some regularity, spectacularly wrong in ways that purely emotional decision-makers are not. This isn't an argument against analytical thinking. It's an argument for understanding what emotions actually are. Because the view of emotions as irrational interference is not just philosophically incorrect, it's strategically costly. It causes people to discard a parallel data stream that is, in certain domains, significantly more accurate than conscious analysis. Emotions are not the opposite of intelligence. They're a different kind of information processing. They evaluate situations against your accumulated experience, your deep values, your pattern library, and they report the results rapidly without requiring conscious deliberation. Fear flags potential threats. Excitement signals alignment with core motivations. Discomfort often indicates a conflict between what you're being asked to do and what you actually believe. Unease about a plan that looks fine on paper is sometimes the most important data point in the room. The question isn't whether to include emotional information in your thinking. You can't exclude it. It's already in there, shaping your analysis in ways you may not be tracking. The question is whether you're processing it consciously and accurately, or whether it's operating invisibly, distorting your supposedly rational analysis without your awareness. Emotional awareness is where the integration begins. This means developing the habit of noticing your emotional responses to situations and asking what they might be signaling, rather than either suppressing them because they feel unprofessional or following them uncritically because they feel true. Strong positive emotion toward a particular option deserves scrutiny. It might be signaling genuine alignment between that option and your values. It might also be signaling that the option is familiar, or flattering to your self-image, or confirms something you already believed. The emotion is real. The interpretation requires work. Strong negative emotion toward an option also deserves scrutiny. It might be flagging a genuine problem your analysis hasn't surfaced. It might be flagging discomfort with novelty, or loss aversion, or a threat to your status that has nothing to do with the actual quality of the option. Emotions are accurate reporters of your internal state. They are not always accurate reporters of external reality. The skill is learning to decode them, to treat emotional signals as the beginning of an inquiry rather than as conclusions. What specifically is triggering this response? What value or expectation is involved? What does this suggest about the situation that my explicit analysis might be missing? I've noticed that the decisions I've most regretted weren't made emotionally or analytically. They were made analytically while ignoring an emotional signal that was, in retrospect, clearly pointing at the exact thing that went wrong. The signal was there. I had decided in advance that it wasn't the kind of data that counted. Emotional regulation in strategic contexts is not about achieving a calm, neutral state. It's about managing your emotional state well enough that emotions can inform your thinking without overwhelming it. This is a meaningful distinction. The goal isn't to reduce emotional intensity to zero. It's to maintain the cognitive bandwidth to process the information emotions are providing, rather than just being moved by it. Cognitive reappraisal is the most evidence-supported tool for this. It involves consciously changing how you interpret a challenging situation, not denying its difficulty, but choosing a frame that promotes clearer thinking rather than reactive response. A setback reframed as information rather than failure. A competitor reframed as a benchmark rather than a threat. An uncomfortable conversation reframed as a problem to be solved rather than an attack to be defended against. The reframe isn't always available, and forcing it when it isn't genuinely accessible produces the hollow positivity that nobody finds useful. But when it is available, when there's a truthful alternative interpretation that produces less reactivity and more clarity, choosing it is not self-deception. It's cognitive performance management. Physical regulation techniques, controlled breathing, brief physical movement, deliberate changes in posture, work through the body rather than through cognition. This matters because high emotional arousal is a physiological state, not just a mental one, and sometimes the fastest way back to clear thinking is through the body rather than through the mind. Telling yourself to calm down while your nervous system is flooded with stress hormones is like trying to reason with a car alarm. The breathing, the movement, the physical interruption. These address the alarm directly rather than arguing with it. Temporal regulation is the third approach. When you're caught in the intensity of a present tense emotional experience, deliberately expanding your time horizon, considering how this situation fits into the arc of a year, a decade, a life, reduces emotional intensity not by denying the current experience, but by contextualizing it. Most things that feel enormous in the present moment look different from a longer vantage point. The temporal shift doesn't make the present moment unimportant. It makes it proportionate. Social awareness extends emotional intelligence outward. Other people's emotional states are data about their priorities, their concerns, their likely responses to different approaches. People who navigate complex organizations and relationships well are almost always skilled readers of collective emotional climate, not just individual signals. The specific skill worth developing is sensitivity to incongruence, the gap between what people say and what their emotional state suggests they mean. Words are easier to control than emotional expression. When someone's verbal content and their emotional presentation are misaligned, the emotional presentation is usually more accurate. The person who says they're fine with a decision while their body language and energy suggest otherwise, is telling you something important that their words are not. Collective emotions are equally worth reading. Organizations, teams, and groups develop emotional climates, shared states of excitement, anxiety, resignation, or momentum that operate beneath the level of explicit communication and significantly influence how information gets processed and how decisions get made. Timing initiatives well, framing communications effectively, understanding why a technically sound proposal keeps failing to gain traction. These questions often have emotional answers that pure strategic analysis misses. Relationship management closes the loop. Understanding emotional dynamics isn't just useful for analysis. It's essential for influence, coordination, and the execution of any strategy that requires other people's participation, which is most strategies. Strategic initiatives fail for emotional reasons more often than for analytical ones. The analysis was sound. The logic was clear. The presentation was thorough. And still the initiative stalled or was resisted or generated the kind of passive non-compliance that looks like agreement and functions like obstruction. Almost always, the failure point is that the emotional needs of key stakeholders, their need to feel heard, respected, consulted, not threatened, were not adequately addressed. This isn't manipulation. It's the recognition that human beings are not logic-processing machines who occasionally have feelings. They're social, emotional creatures who also have the capacity for logical analysis. Strategies that account for the full reality of human decision-making work better than strategies that account only for the part that fits neatly into a spreadsheet. Intuition deserves a specific note here, because it sits at the intersection of emotional and analytical intelligence in a way that's easy to either overtrust or dismiss entirely. Intuitive judgments aren't magical. They're fast processing of complex patterns by systems that operate below conscious awareness. In domains where you have genuine experience, this processing can be remarkably accurate, detecting patterns and relationships that conscious analysis hasn't yet surfaced. The calibration question is what separates reliable intuition from emotional bias. Reliable intuition tends to arrive with a quality of quiet clarity, a settled sense of something being true that doesn't depend on external validation. Emotional bias tends to arrive with charge, urgency, defensiveness, the feeling that something must be true because you need it to be. Neither deserves automatic trust. Both deserve attention. The discipline is in the inquiry that follows, the willingness to ask what this signal is based on, whether it has been accurate in similar situations before, and whether systematic analysis confirms or contradicts it. The intelligence you keep ignoring isn't irrational. It's just operating in a register you were taught to devalue. Start listening, not uncritically, just actually. Chapter 10. How to stay functional when the map is wrong. At some point, the map stops matching the territory. This happens to everyone. The mental frameworks that guided you reliably through one set of conditions begin producing unexpected results as conditions shift. The strategies that generated success in one environment become liabilities in another. The patterns you learn to recognize start appearing in places where they don't actually apply, and the ones that matter start occurring in forms you don't yet have language for. This is not a crisis. It's a recurring feature of navigating a world that changes faster than any individual's capacity to update their understanding of it. The crisis version only arrives when you respond to the map territory mismatch by insisting the map is correct. Adaptable intelligence is the capacity to update before you're forced to. Not after the evidence has become overwhelming. Not after the cost of the mismatch has become undeniable. Before. When the signals are still weak, when the update is still uncomfortable, when the familiar framework is still producing results, just convincing enough to justify keeping it. Almost nobody does this naturally. The cognitive machinery that makes updating difficult, confirmation bias, sunk cost thinking, status quo preference, is the same machinery that makes humans effective in stable environments. It's not a flaw. It's optimization for a world that changed less quickly than this one does. The optimization is now partially obsolete, and recognizing that is the beginning of adaptable intelligence. Intellectual humility is the foundation, not the performed version, the strategic self-deprecation that sophisticated people deploy in public while remaining privately certain they're correct. The actual version, which involves holding your current beliefs with enough looseness that contradictory evidence can actually reach you. This doesn't mean having no convictions. It means calibrating confidence to evidence rather than to identity. The belief that updating your position is weakness rather than accuracy is one of the more expensive cognitive mistakes available to people who are otherwise quite intelligent. Most belief updating happens under duress. The evidence accumulates past a threshold, the cost of the mismatch becomes impossible to ignore, and the update occurs, usually accompanied by a retrospective story about how the person saw it coming. Active belief updating happens differently. It happens through deliberate inquiry, regularly examining your core assumptions, not because they feel wrong, but because all assumptions degrade over time as conditions change, and the ones that feel most solid are often the ones most worth examining, because their solidity may reflect confidence rather than accuracy. The belief audit is a practical implementation of this. At regular intervals, quarterly is enough for most people, you identify the assumptions underlying your most important decisions and ask 3 questions. What originally convinced me this was true? What would convince me it might be wrong? Have I actively looked for that evidence recently? The third question is where most audits fail. People ask the first 2 and feel intellectually thorough. They skip the third because actually looking for disconfirming evidence is uncomfortable in a way that hypothetically entertaining its possibility is not. The discomfort is the point. If you're only willing to update your beliefs on evidence that arrives without effort, you're not practicing active belief updating. You're just calling confirmation bias by a more flattering name. Seeking out intelligent disagreement is the natural extension of this. Not the performative kind, asking people who disagree with you while subtly signaling that disagreement is unwelcome, then reporting that you consulted widely. The actual kind, which involves identifying people whose judgment you respect, who hold positions you find genuinely uncomfortable, understanding the full force of their reasoning rather than the weakest version of it, and asking whether that reasoning changes anything about your current position. This is harder than it sounds, because genuinely good arguments for positions you currently reject are threatening in a way that weak arguments are not. A weak opposing argument confirms your position. A strong one requires you to do something with it. Mental model diversification is the structural approach to adaptability. Just as a single investment concentrated in one asset is fragile to changes in that asset's value, a single mental framework concentrated in one discipline is fragile to changes that the framework wasn't designed to anticipate. Multiple frameworks applied to the same situation produce resilience. When one framework's predictions fail, others may still be generating useful insight. The practice is deliberate. When analyzing an important situation, You consciously apply multiple disciplinary lenses. How would an economist frame this? What would a systems theorist emphasize? What does a game theorist see that a psychologist might miss? Each lens highlights different aspects of the same reality. The aspects that appear in multiple lenses simultaneously deserve particular attention. The aspects that appear in only one may be artifacts of the lens rather than features of the situation. This multi-perspective analysis is not the same as being unable to reach conclusions. The goal is not perpetual analytical paralysis dressed up as intellectual sophistication. The goal is reaching conclusions that are more robust, that have been stress-tested against multiple frameworks and survived, rather than conclusions that reflect the particular lens you happen to apply first. Scenario-based thinking builds adaptability into your planning, rather than treating adaptability as something you'll manage when change arrives. The conventional planning approach commits to a single expected future and optimizes for it. This works when the expected future arrives. When it doesn't, when conditions diverge from your projections in ways that matter, the single future plan becomes not just wrong, but actively constraining, because you've built infrastructure, commitments, and expectations around assumptions that no longer hold. Scenario planning replaces the single future with several plausible ones, develops strategies that work reasonably well across multiple scenarios rather than optimally in one, and identifies the early warning signals that would suggest each scenario is becoming more likely. The plan becomes adaptive by design rather than adaptive by emergency. You've already thought through the pivots. When signals appear, you're updating a probability distribution, not improvising from scratch. The hidden value of scenario planning isn't the scenarios themselves. It's what the construction process reveals about your current assumptions. When you're forced to articulate what would have to be true for each scenario to materialize, you frequently discover assumptions in your current approach that you hadn't noticed. Things you were treating as certainties that are actually significant uncertainties. The scenario planning is diagnostic as much as it is preparatory. Learning velocity becomes the critical variable in rapidly changing environments. In stable environments, the depth of what you know is the primary advantage. In changing environments, the speed at which you can update what you know becomes equally important. The question is not just whether you can learn, but whether you can learn faster than the rate of change in your domain. This argues for focusing learning effort on meta-skills, capabilities that transfer across domains, rather than knowledge specific to current conditions. Critical thinking, pattern recognition, communication, and the ability to learn efficiently are valuable regardless of what specific knowledge becomes obsolete. Domain-specific expertise will continue to matter, but its half-life is shortening. The person who can develop new expertise quickly has an advantage that the person who has developed deep expertise slowly cannot replicate once conditions shift. Rapid experimentation is the operational version of this principle. Instead of treating your strategies as plans to be executed, you treat them as hypotheses to be tested. Small, cheap experiments that generate real feedback about whether your current approach is working, before you've committed significant resources to it, before the cost of being wrong has become substantial. The experimental mindset doesn't mean never committing. It means committing provisionally and with explicit criteria for what would cause you to update. Feedback loop design is the infrastructure version. Most people rely on ambient feedback, the general sense that things are going well or poorly that accumulates from unstructured observation. This works when feedback is fast and clear. It fails when there are significant delays between actions and outcomes, when causality is ambiguous, or when your natural psychological tendencies cause you to interpret ambiguous signals as confirming your current approach. Designing explicit feedback systems means identifying the leading indicators that would change first if your approach were failing, monitoring them systematically rather than occasionally, and building in enough objectivity to override the motivated interpretation that ambient feedback is vulnerable to. The system doesn't have to be complicated. It has to be honest. Anti-fragile design is the frame that pulls this all together. The goal of adaptable intelligence isn't just to survive change without being destroyed by it. It's to build approaches that become more effective under stress, that use volatility and uncertainty as inputs rather than threats. Optionality, diversity of approaches, redundancy in critical systems, the capacity to learn from disruption rather than just absorb it. These are the architectural features of strategies that improve when conditions become difficult, rather than merely holding on. The map will be wrong again. It's always wrong eventually. The question is whether you've built the kind of relationship with your maps that allows you to update them before the territory punishes you for the mismatch. Most people are emotionally attached to their maps. They've invested in them, built identity around them, defended them in public. Updating feels like losing. It isn't losing. It's navigation. Chapter 11. The Quiet Mechanics of Changing Minds. The least effective way to change someone's mind is to explain clearly and logically why they're wrong. This seems like it shouldn't be true. It feels like it shouldn't be true. You have the evidence. You have the argument. The reasoning is sound. You present it carefully with appropriate supporting detail, and the person across from you becomes not convinced exactly, but more entrenched. More committed to the position they held before you started. More certain, somehow, that they were right. This is a documented phenomenon. It has a name. Researchers call it the backfire effect, and while subsequent studies have complicated the picture, it doesn't occur in every context, with every topic, for every person. The underlying mechanism is real and worth understanding. When people feel that their beliefs are under attack, they don't evaluate the incoming evidence neutrally. They defend. The self, for most people, is partially constituted by its beliefs, particularly the beliefs that carry social or identity weight. An attack on the belief is experienced as an attack on the person, and people are significantly better at defending themselves than at updating themselves. This is the first thing strategic influence requires you to internalize. You are not primarily in the business of presenting arguments. You are in the business of creating conditions under which people can arrive at better conclusions while feeling like themselves throughout the process. That reframe changes almost everything about how you approach persuasion. Reciprocity is the principle that tends to get framed most superficially in discussions of influence, as a transactional mechanism, a favor economy, a way of engineering psychological debt. The transactional framing misses what makes it actually powerful. The reciprocity principle is triggered most reliably not by the size of a gesture, but by its specificity. A small action that demonstrates genuine understanding of what someone actually needs creates more goodwill than an expensive gesture that demonstrates only that you could afford it. This means that effective reciprocity requires real attention first. You have to understand what someone values, not what people in their role generally value, not what you'd value in their position, but what they specifically care about given who they are and what they're navigating right now. That understanding, expressed through action, creates the kind of relational foundation that transactional favor trading never produces. It also produces something more durable than obligation. It produces trust. Social proof operates through a mechanism most people understand in principle and misapply in practice. People in uncertain situations look to the behavior of others, particularly others they identify with, to calibrate their own. The misapplication is treating social proof as a numbers game. If enough people have done this, you should too. The actual leverage is in specificity of identification. The most persuasive social proof isn't that many people have made this choice. It's that people recognizably similar to you, in circumstances recognizably similar to yours, have made this choice, and here is what happened. The identification has to be genuine. People are reasonably sophisticated detectors of forced similarity. When the social proof feels constructed, when the person cited as similar doesn't actually resemble them in the ways that matter, the mechanism doesn't just fail. It produces skepticism that extends to the broader claim. When the identification is real, social proof does something that logical argument can't. It reduces the psychological risk of changing position. Changing your mind feels less dangerous when you can see that reasonable people like you have already done it and survived. Commitment and consistency describe perhaps the most underappreciated dynamic in influence. Once people take a position publicly, even a small, seemingly low-stakes position, they experience genuine psychological pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. The self-image as a consistent person, as someone whose words and actions align, is worth protecting. People will work harder to maintain consistency with a prior commitment than to accept a logically superior argument that contradicts it. The strategic implication is that small early commitments matter disproportionately. Getting someone to articulate in their own words, even a partial version of the conclusion you want them to reach, is more valuable than presenting that conclusion to them fully formed. When people generate the argument themselves, they become invested in it. It becomes their position, not yours, that they're being asked to accept. This is why the most skilled persuaders spend more time asking questions than making statements. The questions are designed to draw out the reasoning that leads toward the desired conclusion, not through manipulation, but through genuine inquiry that helps people think through implications they hadn't fully examined. The conclusion they arrive at feels earned because it was. It just had a thoughtful guide. Framing effects are among the most practically significant findings in behavioral psychology and among the most consistently underused in real persuasion. The same information, presented in different frames, produces reliably different decisions. This isn't about spin or deception. It's about the fact that information is never received in a vacuum. It's always interpreted against a reference point, and the reference point shapes what the information means. Loss framing tends to be more motivating than gain framing for risk-averse decisions. People work harder to avoid losing something they have than to acquire something equivalent they don't have. When presenting a change initiative, emphasizing what will be lost by not changing is typically more motivating than emphasizing what will be gained by changing, even when the logical content is identical. This isn't exploitation of irrationality. It's accurate communication about the full cost structure of a decision that pure gain framing incompletely represents. Not changing has costs. Those costs are real. Presenting them is honest. Presenting only the gains of changing while leaving the costs of not changing implicit is actually the less complete communication. Anchoring, which we've already examined as a cognitive bias, becomes a tool in strategic communication. The first reference point established in a conversation disproportionately influences all subsequent judgments. In negotiations, This means that making the first offer, when you have a well-reasoned basis for your position, establishes a reference point that subsequent adjustments move from. The final agreement tends to settle closer to the anchor than it would have if the other party had anchored first. In presentations and proposals, the anchor is the initial framing of what success looks like, what the appropriate scale of investment is, what comparable situations have produced. Establishing ambitious reference points early makes subsequent requests seem proportionate in ways they wouldn't against a different anchor. The anchor doesn't compel any particular outcome. It shapes the gravitational field within which outcomes tend to settle. Authority and expertise influence work through a specific mechanism worth understanding clearly. People defer to perceived experts, not because they've verified the expertise, but because expertise claims reduce the cognitive burden of evaluation. When you trust that someone knows what they're talking about, you don't have to verify everything yourself. This is rational. Nobody can be expert in everything, and deference to expertise is generally adaptive. The implication for strategic influence is that demonstrating competence is more valuable than asserting it. Insights that others find genuinely useful, predictions that prove accurate, acknowledgement of the limits of your knowledge in areas outside your expertise. These build the kind of credibility that generates real deference rather than polite attention. The specific combination that works most powerfully is confidence within your domain paired with genuine humility outside it. The humility signals that the confidence is calibrated rather than performed, which makes the confidence trustworthy. Scarcity and urgency are worth treating with care because they're among the most abused influence mechanisms, and the abuse has made people appropriately suspicious of them. Artificial scarcity, the limited time offer that's always available, the exclusive opportunity that everyone receives, doesn't just fail. It actively signals untrustworthiness, which poisons subsequent influence attempts. Real scarcity, handled honestly, serves a legitimate function. It helps people overcome the procrastination and analysis paralysis that causes them to defer decisions past the point where the opportunity remains available. The honest version of urgency focuses on opportunity costs, what becomes unavailable or more costly over time, rather than manufactured deadlines. It respects the other person's ability to assess their own situation while providing genuinely relevant information about the time sensitivity of the decision. Underneath all of these specific mechanisms is a single organizing principle that most influence frameworks understate. Strategic influence isn't primarily about technique. It's about genuine understanding of the person you're trying to influence, their actual concerns, their real constraints, their specific emotional needs in this situation. Technique applied without understanding produces the kind of persuasion that works once and produces resentment afterward. Understanding applied with technique produces something different. It produces the experience for the person being influenced of having been genuinely seen. And that experience, more than any argument or mechanism, is what creates the willingness to move. The quiet mechanics of changing minds are, at their foundation, the mechanics of genuine attention. Everything else is just how you express it. Chapter 12. The system is not broken. The system is working exactly as designed. When the same problem keeps recurring, despite repeated attempts to solve it, most people's instinct is to try harder. More effort, more resources, more sophisticated versions of the interventions that haven't worked yet. The problem persists, and the response is to escalate, to push harder against something that keeps pushing back with equal and opposite force. What almost nobody stops to ask is the question that changes everything. What if the system is producing exactly the outcomes it's designed to produce? Not designed intentionally, necessarily. Not designed by anyone in particular with any particular malicious objective, but designed in the structural sense, the sense that systems are constituted by relationships, incentives, feedback loops, and rules that together generate predictable outputs. When those outputs are the outputs you want, the design is invisible. When they're the outputs you don't want, the design becomes worth examining. This is the central insight of systems thinking, and it's one of those ideas that sounds obvious until you actually apply it, at which point it tends to be quietly devastating to a number of things you previously believed about why problems persist. The fundamental structure of any system consists of three things: elements, relationships, and purpose. The elements, the people, organizations, physical components, are usually the most visible part. The relationships between elements are usually more important and considerably less visible. The purpose, what the system is actually organized around, as revealed by its behavior rather than its stated goals, is often invisible entirely and frequently surprises the people operating within it. A company that says it values innovation but only promotes people who avoid risks is not, in any functional sense, a company that values innovation. Its purpose, as revealed by its actual behavior, is risk minimization. The stated value is aspiration. The revealed purpose is what the system produces. Understanding this distinction between what a system claims to optimize for and what it actually optimizes for explains an enormous amount of organizational dysfunction that seems mysterious when analyzed purely at the level of individual behavior or explicit policy. Feedback loops are the mechanism through which systems maintain their behavior over time, and understanding them is the primary analytical tool of systems thinking. We've encountered them before, but in the context of systems thinking specifically, they deserve more precise attention. Reinforcing loops amplify whatever is already moving. They're the engine of exponential growth and exponential decline. A company with strong products attracts talented people, who build better products, which attracts more talented people. The loop runs forward. The same structure runs backward. Declining quality triggers departures of the best people, which accelerates quality decline, which triggers more departures. The loop doesn't care about direction. It amplifies. What makes reinforcing loops particularly important for problem solving is that they explain persistence. A problem sustained by a reinforcing loop will not respond to interventions that address symptoms rather than the loop itself. You can pour resources into the symptom indefinitely, and the loop will regenerate it. The fix that doesn't address the loop isn't a fix. It's maintenance. Balancing loops create stability by counteracting changes. When a system deviates from a target state, balancing loops generate corrective pressure. Prices that rise too high trigger reduced demand that pushes them back down. Bodies that overheat trigger cooling mechanisms that restore temperature. Organizations that drift too far from their core competency tend to generate internal corrective pressure that pulls them back, sometimes usefully, sometimes as resistance to necessary change. The practically important thing about balancing loops is that they explain why systems push back against interventions. When you try to force a system to change, through mandate, incentive, or structural pressure, the balancing loops that maintain the current state generate countervailing force. This isn't conspiracy or recalcitrance. It's the system doing what systems do. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the resistance. It helps you design interventions that work with the loop rather than against it, or that address the loop itself rather than trying to overpower it. Donella Meadows mapped leverage points in systems from least to most effective, and the hierarchy is worth internalizing because it directly contradicts where most people focus their intervention efforts. The lowest leverage interventions change numbers within systems: budgets, targets, rates, standards. These feel significant because they're visible, measurable, and involve real resources. They rarely produce lasting change because the system structure that generated the current numbers will generate similar numbers again once the intervention pressure relaxes. You've changed a parameter. The system hasn't changed. Higher leverage comes from changing the elements within systems, replacing personnel, introducing new technology, modifying organizational components. Higher still from changing the connections, the information flows, decision authorities, reporting relationships that determine how elements interact. When you change who talks to whom, who has access to what information, who can make which decisions, you alter the structure that generates behavior rather than just the behavior itself. Rules represent very high leverage. The policies, procedures, and incentive structures that govern behavior within a system shape everything downstream of them. Change the rules and you change the structural context within which all other decisions get made. This is why policy changes tend to have large effects, and why the effects are often unintended, because rules interact with existing loops in ways that are hard to predict without systems analysis. The power to make rules is higher leverage still. Constitutional structures, governance arrangements, the distribution of authority over how policies get set. These meta-level structures determine how all subsequent rules get made. Changes here tend to have profound long-term effects, precisely because they don't just change current rules. They change who has the authority to make future rules. The highest leverage point is the paradigm, the shared set of beliefs, assumptions, and values from which a system arises. Paradigms determine what is considered possible, desirable, and legitimate within a system. They're largely invisible to the people operating within them, because the paradigm shapes what looks normal rather than appearing as a perspective among other perspectives. It just seems like reality. When paradigms shift, systems restructure entirely around new organizing principles. Scientific paradigm shifts redirect entire research programs. Business paradigm shifts restructure industries. Personal paradigm shifts reorganize entire life patterns. This is why paradigm-level interventions are simultaneously the highest leverage and the most difficult. The difficulty isn't technical. It's the near impossibility of seeing clearly from within a paradigm that you're currently inside. Unintended consequences are perhaps the most practically important feature of systems to understand, because they're the most common reason that intelligent, well-intentioned interventions produce outcomes opposite to their intent. Systems respond to interventions not just at the point of contact, but throughout their structure, triggering feedback loops and adaptations that weren't anticipated because the analysis stopped at the first-order effects. Policy resistance is the systemic version of this. When you push on a system, the system pushes back. Solutions that ignore this generate what systems theorists call fixes that fail. Quick interventions that relieve symptoms temporarily while making underlying conditions worse, because the intervention itself triggers compensatory responses that regenerate the problem at a deeper level. The systems archetypes that Meadows and others identified are recurring structural patterns that appear across different domains and reliably produce characteristic dysfunctional outcomes. Fixes that fail. shifting the burden. The pattern where addressing symptoms, rather than root causes, progressively weakens the system's capacity to address its own fundamental problems. Tragedy of the commons, where individually rational behavior produces collectively irrational outcomes through the degradation of shared resources. Recognizing these archetypes when you encounter them is enormously useful, because each one has a characteristic intervention logic. When you see the shifting the burden structure, you know that addressing the symptomatic solution more aggressively will make things worse. The leverage is in the fundamental solution, even when it's harder and slower. When you see the tragedy of the commons, you know that individual incentive adjustments are insufficient. The structure requires either governance of the shared resource or transformation of the individual incentives that are depleting it. The practical implication of all of this for how you approach persistent problems is significant. Before escalating effort on interventions that haven't worked, ask what structural features of the system are generating the problem. Map the feedback loops. Identify where the system is optimizing and for what. Find the leverage point that corresponds to the actual structural cause, rather than the visible symptom. Then intervene there, with appropriate expectations about resistance. Because the system will resist, especially if you're operating near the higher leverage points, where the intervention threatens the structures that define how the system works. The system is not broken. This bears repeating because it's the frame that makes everything else in systems thinking coherent. The system is producing exactly what its structure produces. Your frustration with the outputs is not a diagnosis. The structure is the diagnosis. Change the structure. Everything downstream changes with it. You started this book operating on a model of reality that was probably several updates behind where it needed to be. That's not a criticism. That's the default human condition. The gap between how we think and how we actually think is not a personal failing. It's the baseline, the starting position for everyone who hasn't deliberately done something about it. The question now is what you do with the distance between knowing this and actually changing anything. Here's what I've learned watching people encounter ideas like these. Most will find them genuinely interesting. A smaller number will think about applying them. A smaller number still will actually try. And a fraction of that group will try consistently enough and long enough that the thinking becomes structural. Not a technique they deploy occasionally, but an architecture they inhabit. That last group is not smarter. They're not more disciplined by nature. They just took the ideas seriously enough to feel slightly uncomfortable, which is exactly where change lives. The gap doesn't close because you understood the material. It closes because you made a different decision than you would have made before you understood it. Then another. Then enough of them, accumulated over enough time, that the quality of your thinking becomes visibly different from what it was. That's the whole project. Not a transformation, a practice. Imperfect, ongoing, occasionally frustrating, and substantially more useful than the alternative. You now have the tools, the mental models, the debiasing techniques, the systems thinking, the pattern recognition, the emotional intelligence, the communication architecture. They're real. They work. They compound. Which means the return on using them increases over time in ways that aren't yet visible from here. What happens next is entirely a function of one thing: whether you use them when the moment actually arrives. It will arrive.